Well, it's shaping up to be another year of fear and FOMO, conspiracy theories, and everything in between. It's going to be an exciting year. Now, what does that mean for gold and silver? It's actually really interesting. One of the big things that, with regard to gold and silver, is that as a stacker, it does become more and more difficult as time passes to kind of keep that passion for adding to your stack. Now, when you get your first pieces of gold, silver, particularly, gold, I would say. Silver is always pretty exciting when you first get it, but then it starts to fall into a rut. But when you get your first pieces of gold, it kind of takes on a different level. There's a different feeling with regard to gold than there is with silver. And I think anybody that's, purchased gold bullion definitely can attest to that. Now, the interesting thing that, I've been thinking about is with, how everything's kind of been since the pandemic. I think the experience of the pandemic was very different for different people that live in different areas of the country. Places that kind of just disregarded the, lockdowns or health orders or things like that had a very different experience than, places where there were those kind of things. Obviously, I'm in California, so we did have those kind of things. But besides all the political and blah, 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 conspiracy theories, all that stuff, thinking more along the lines of what it taught me about what happens during something like that, an extreme event, something unforeseen, something that, you really can't plan too much for. Now, of course, we have preppers and different things like that, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, on a day-to-day basis, not something that you would have planned for. One of the things that we saw was, initially it's kind of like, you have to take care of yourself. You have to, have the resources to feed yourself, take care of yourself and your family, that kind of thing. And then from there, it goes to a different spot, a different place with a lot of people. And that's the part that I find interesting, and especially how particularly gold and silver could potentially play into that. Now, one of the big examples I would say of the pandemic was, at first, when you saw, the compassion of different people and, people trying to take care of people and do things, for other people. And then you also saw the other side of the spectrum. You saw people just, ridiculously stockpiling things, like not, hey, I need this, but more just to profiteer off of the situation itself. A great example is things like toilet paper. We saw plenty of morons out there just, taking all the toilet paper and, trying to resell it and things like that. There will always be those people who try to, profit, I would say. I'm looking for the right word, to take advantage of the situation and, to their benefit. And that brings me to where, gold and silver, because the deeper thought on that end of the spectrum is, with regard to gold and silver, one of the things that I notice about people, particularly since the pandemic, there's a certain group of people out there who are borderline cheering for like the end of the system. Like, oh, the system's going to end. And I think, from a profit motive, there are lots of, companies that take advantage of that. Not just companies, individuals, YouTube channels, things like that just constantly stoke up that fear and kind of make it seem more and more realistic that, the system's going to come to an end, and in some fashion, gold and silver are going to protect you, or things like that. Now, having gone through something, like the pandemic, and seeing, the reactions of people and things like that, it is interesting, because I ask myself, like, with regard to the pandemic, or regard to the system as we currently know it, think about, like, what's really going on if the system fails. Really, if the system fails, the biggest people, the biggest losers are, the wealthy, the elite of, the country, of the system. They're the ones who stand to lose the most. Not, Joe and Jane with their savings account, or, that kind of stuff. Although, of course, they'll suffer as well. But I mean, the real people who would lose everything would be the rich people. They would be brought down to be just like anybody else, right? And in reality, nothing would really protect them from that. They can have weapons, they can have, gold and silver, but at the end of the day, they're just not in the same position that they were. Now, where I'm going with this is, play that through in your head, like, where at first, again, in a real SHTF, which, make no mistake, if the monetary system or the economic system, collapse, that is SHTF. That is the very definition of SHTF. And at first, it would be hey, I got to take care of myself, right? That's the rational response to something like that. But then the next stage of that is taking advantage of the situation, either for gain of some sort or to just put yourself in a better position. Again, what's the next rational thought? Does gold and silver really do that? I would argue no, at least in the short run. Particularly because at that point, everyone's so desperate that, even if you had gold and silver, who's to say they wouldn't just kill you for whatever you had? And again, there are people who say, well, other people out there would, have gold and silver and you could trade and do things like that. Yeah, but the thing is, there are going to be far more valuable things than, bullion, especially in the beginning of something like that. No one's going to be thinking about, old school wealth when you can't, find food or water or medicine or all of these other things. And I think about that and I'm like, what would really be, other than, food, water, shelter? Those are obviously, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Those are going to be the obvious go-tos, right? But in that scenario where everything collapses, what would propel you to the next level as far as making you the elite, making you the powerful one? It's not going to be things like this. It's just not. Especially initially, because there would be no reason to go to any monetary system like this. Basically looking at gold and silver, think about it really, kind of take a really deep thought and think about gold and silver. What are you doing if you're using gold and silver during the SHTF? You're reestablishing the old system. This is reestablishing the old system. You're basically, now, some people think about it, and I think this view is kind of really topical. They think, well, we're going back to a monetary system that's based on something, physical, an actual asset. There's truth to that, right? But in the end, this system evolved into the system that we have now. And so basically it would be, again, starting the precursor, using the same mechanisms that they did back then in order to reestablish the system that led to where we are now. Does that seem like, a wise decision? Does that seem like what would really be, people would be after, complete collapse? Now, the argument could be made, well, you need some kind of a system. Yes. But again, in a real SHTF, in the real end all to be all, and again, that I'm not saying quite Armageddon, so that's not what I'm getting at, but just where, there's no distribution. I don't think many people really think it through. They think that, okay, well, we can't go to the bank, so then, we'll find some other way to keep the status quo. No, that's not going to be the case, because it's all just going to come to a crashing halt. Who's going to, produce the food if you're not getting paid? Who's going to grow the food if you're not getting paid? Who's going to distribute the food if you're not getting paid? And so some system would come about, most likely some form of barter, right? But the key is, this isn't going to get you anywhere. Could it play a small role? Yes. But again, even in that scenario, would people want to reestablish the system from its basics? And that's what this would do, because then it would be, who has the gold? Who has the silver? You put, the elite right back on top. Is that really what's going to happen? Or would people be upset that, hey, the system that you created came crashing down, we're going to do it a different way this time? I don't know. But it's definitely something to think about and something to contemplate, because you may not be getting the protection that you thought you were getting from something like this. Now, okay, well, if that's the case, why do you stack? I stack for a lot of reasons. I like collecting stuff. I like the idea of, it has monetary value as well as, the collectible aspect. I do think that there's, a certain level of protection there in different ways. Not necessarily, SHTF per se, but other things just to have a physical asset in case you were, up the creek and you needed something. I guess it's better to have something than nothing. But is it the savior that people make it out to be? Is gold and silver going to be what, separates the haves from the have-nots? No, it's not going to be. And when you hear people say things like, "Oh, look at Venezuela, they used gold and silver," okay, but that's not a real SHTF. Why? Because again, they're surrounded by other countries. There's, that are perfectly stable systems that they can. It's not the same thing. If there was, I would argue that if the United States collapsed from an economic standpoint, from a currency standpoint, the whole world's going to be right there with them. It's not going to be Venezuela or, Argentina or Chile. It is going to be like the real end all to be all, because we have our hands in everyone else's pocket. And so it's a different scenario. You can learn lessons from what goes on and things like that, but it is not comparable. This is the thing. And I mean, you have so many people in this country that, have never even been, so many people in this country have barely left their state, let alone have gone to other countries and, seen what, goes on there, pros and cons of different things. So, to extrapolate what you see on the news or you hear on blah, blah, blah about what's going on in Venezuela or it's just not the same thing. It's just not. Secondly, there is a flip side to what I mentioned at the onset, which is, in the beginning of the pandemic, one of the things that really stood out to me is a lot of people did go out of their way to help other people. They really did, stop what they were doing. And as long as, they were okay, and in some cases, it wasn't even that, they went to go help other people, whether it was, bringing them food or different things like that. And the stupidest things. Even looking at what happened in China or, supposedly happened, I wasn't there, so we'll see. But, with regard to, when people were literally locked down in their, houses, how they would go outside and sing at night or things like that. That level of community and that level of just trying to stay keep humanity on a certain level. There were a lot of examples of that kind of thing here. And again, whether you agree or not with, lockdowns or this, that, and the other thing, that's irrelevant. That you can make, you can argue all day about that kind of stuff. The thing is, what did you learn from it? What did you see about how people react during something like that? And is a tool like this really the appropriate tool to protect yourself? I would argue it's not. Is it a piece of the puzzle? I don't even think really realistically, at the end of the day, for something like that, it is beyond a small amount. Now, a real true stacker, there are a lot of things that, stacking can do for you, but is it in the SHTF? Is it really going to be, that big of a benefit? Probably not, especially if you have a lot of value locked in something like this, where you could have that in a variety of other things that would be more beneficial. And so it is an interesting time going into, this year. We've been through so many different, news cycles for the last couple of years and so many events that it just seems like time is flying. It is the time to think about things like this because, it is important. Not everybody has a disposable income to be buying bullion and other things. And so where you put your money matters. Something like this, can it have benefit? Yes. But I would argue SHTF isn't one of them.